This equitation science paper was published in 2018. There are 7 researchers who are all experts in their field, taking a look at Marie-Thérèse Engell's credentials. The lead researcher is based at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences in the Department of Anatomy, Physiology and Biochemistry. She has 12 publications showing 9,800 reads, so her work is very important, with 63 citations. And she researches veterinary medicine, physiotherapy and neurology. Her skills and expertise are posture, postural balance, biomechanics, gait analysis, movement analysis and physical rehabilitation. So she is very well skilled with a high level of expertise to interpret the research findings. Except for Professor Clayton, who is based in the USA, these researchers are all based in the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, in the same faculty. Hernlund has 83 publications, 27,000 reads and 600 citations. So that tells me she's been doing some very important work that many have referred to. Skills and expertise: veterinary medicine, sports medicine, injury prevention, biomechanics, exercise science and movement. And the publications, I won't scroll through them all, but you can find them on the researchgate.net website. Anna Bystrom has 56 publications, 29,000 reads, 636 citations, and her skills and expertise are veterinary anatomy, equine biomechanics, motion analysis, kinematics, and motion capture. So I have to have a slight reservation here that I'm not seeing any rider specialists, but they're well placed within the university. 7 of them are collaborating on this project and they have access to some very sophisticated technology. So I will continue looking into the backgrounds of these researchers, although I do recognise the names as being highly eminent in the field of equitation research. Agneta Egenvall has 195 publications, 72,000 reads and 5,700 citations. Skills and expertise are epidemiology, dogs, Ehrlichia, not quite sure what that is. Let's just click and see. So it is tick-borne diseases, health status, horses, genetics, biomechanics. And I won't scroll through all 195 publications, but it's well worth referring to these researchers on ResearchGate for some very high quality papers. Anna Bergh has 25 publications, 8,000 reads and 188 citations. Her skills and expertise are pain assessment, physiotherapy, biomechanics, pain management, pain measurement, rehabilitation, motion analysis, physical rehabilitation and sports injuries. So yes, this is the researcher I've been hoping to find associated with this topic. And Professor Hilary Clayton, who is CEO of Sport Horse Science, LC. Professor and Mary Ann MacPhail, Dressage Chair, Emerita, BVMS, PhD, Diplomat, ACVSMR Fellow of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. It's always encouraging to see Professor Hilary Clayton involved with equitation research papers because she is a leader in her field. And I'm encouraged because I feel like there's going to be a good measure of quality control of the information within the paper. 382 publications, 250,000 reads, and 6,000 citations. Currently involved with biomechanics of collection and self-carriage in dressage horses, equine show jumping technique, para-dressage rider skills, asymmetry in horses and riders, and equestrian technique. So I need to dig around and find her latest publications, because this is exactly what I'm looking at the moment for my research project. Her skills and expertise are gait analysis, sport biomechanics, rehabilitation, posture, movement analysis, kinesiology, musculoskeletal disorders, sports science, exercise science. And again, we can find her papers below. So she was based in Michigan State University, and before that the University of Saskatchewan in Canada, and she qualified as a vet in 1968 at the University of Glasgow. So 50 years of expertise there. So Professor Clayton really does know her onions, as they say. And Lars Roepstorff, apologies if I have that pronunciation wrong. And just because the researchers are at the end of the list, it doesn't mean that they have the least amount of expertise. On the contrary. So Lars is a professor in the Department of Anatomy, Physiology and Biochemistry, and he has 137 publications, 66,000 reads and 3,200 citations. His skills and expertise are exercise performance, sport physiology, sports injuries, biomechanics, sports science, exercise physiology, strength and conditioning, and injury prevention. So go to the site if you want to look up his publications. So this is what I consider to be a crack team for researching the topic that I'm interested in. And not just researching it, I'm very fussy about interpretation of the results, because it's not unusual to get to the end of a paper and have the researchers not being able to explain their results. The abstract, a few notes from that. For efficient rider-horse communication, the rider needs to maintain a balanced position for independent and controlled movements of the rider's body segments, and their balance will most likely be negatively affected by postural asymmetries. The aim of this study was to evaluate intersegmental symmetry of movements of the rider's pelvis, trunk and head segments in the frontal plane, so that's looking at them either from behind or in front, while rocking a balance chair from side to side, and to compare this to the rider's frontal plane symmetry when walking. So I like that they're asking the rider to operate a balance chair, because in some way this is a movement that the rider would be familiar with on a horse, or that is generated by a horse. Frontal plane rotations, or roll, of the pelvis, trunk and head segments and relative translations between the segments were analysed in 20 moderately skilled riders seated on a balance chair and rocking it from side to side. So again, this is another equitation paper where we don't have a large cohort, which to me is disappointing. So they say they were moderately skilled riders. So they collected three-dimensional kinematic data using a motion capture video, and they used principal component analysis and linear regression to evaluate the data. None of the riders displayed a symmetrical right-left pattern of frontal plane rotation and translation in any of their core body segments. So out of 20 riders, they all displayed asymmetry in their core body segments, which varied to a high degree between individuals. And the first three principal components explained the majority of between rider variation in these patterns, to 89%. A significant relationship was found indicating that during walking, when foot eversion was present on one side, that's when the foot rolls big toe up. Pelvic trunk roll during rocking the chair was asymmetric and larger to that same side, which is a very interesting finding. So they're relating the foot or the feet to pelvic motion, and that this individual variation was markedly large. However, there was a significant association to the rider's foot pattern while walking, so this means we can see that in the rider as they walk, so that's a good evaluation technique, suggesting consistent intra-individual patterns over multiple situations. So I definitely want to know more about that. And for further studies, they suggest confirming associations between the findings in this study and rider asymmetry while riding. So they want to connect rider asymmetry on a balance chair and compare that with when the rider rides the horse. Riders' postural control can likely be improved, and this may enhance their sport performance. Yes. So we know this. We know it's fairly obvious that if the rider targets improvement of postural control, then it can improve their riding. But actually, rider evaluation is not mainstream at the moment. So we need many more papers like this to convince the riders that they do need this postural evaluation, and for these reasons. So the introduction. So riding is a very popular sport in Sweden for females, and in order to perform optimally, they need to be able to communicate precisely with the horse using predominantly physical cues that are transmitted to the horse via the rider's seat, pelvis, legs and hands, which will allow independent and controlled movements of the limbs and core body segments, pelvis, trunk and head. The horse's back movements involve gait-specific translations, vertical, longitudinal and transverse, and rotations, which they refer to as yaw, roll and pitch rotations around the vertical, longitudinal and transverse axes. And what that means very simply is within 3 dimensions of movement, which determine the movement control strategies required from the rider. The rider's movements are generated by perturbations, in other words, in response to the horse's movements. And expert riders solve this task with a lower variability of sagittal plane movements in relation to the horse. That means that as you look at an advanced rider or expert rider from the side, you'll see very little movement from them. And they are also able to maintain a more consistent movement pattern in their mount. And that means because they are stable and sit still, that transfers to the horse, which enables the horse to maintain a more consistent movement pattern. In other words, harmony. Balance is the ability of a human to balance in a static situation, and it's related to the position of the centre of mass within the area of the base of support. But vision contributes to regulation of balance, and posture tends to decrease with expertise. And this means that expert riders rely less on their vision for balance than novice riders. And this process is refined over many years of training. It doesn't have to be years if fitness preparation is performed from the ground off the horse. Intersegmental position, stability and movement of the pelvis, trunk and head in both the frontal and sagittal planes are central to determining the rider's effectiveness. If those core body segments are not adequately balanced, stabilised and controlled, it will adversely affect the rider's balance and coordination. Then they go on to talk about symmetry and that it's highly relevant to be able to excel in the sport, and that the horse has to be symmetrical too and equally dynamic, balanced and flexible on both reins. Rider symmetry is therefore highly relevant, and it's generally agreed that a symmetrical rider has a better possibility to influence the horse in an optimal way. Rider asymmetry has been suggested to be associated with underperformance and injury to both the horse and rider, but we have to remember that some 80+% of them ride while in pain. So it may not be just the asymmetry, but that may be a factor. And several studies have documented systematic asymmetries in riders while riding, and experienced riders, who you would think may become more symmetrical the longer they ride over time, have been reported to sit in an asymmetrical posture with the pelvis rotated and twisted to the right, the trunk twisted to the left. So they're not entirely specific with that. So the inference is that experienced riders tend to be crooked, but from which plane are they viewing the riders from to report twisting? Is that to the right vertically or to the right horizontally? And with a greater external rotation of the right hip. That's a bit more specific. There have been various unmounted tests and unmounted physiotherapy exercise programs that focus on symmetry have been developed to improve the rider's symmetry during riding. And again, we'd have to look at the cohort numbers. So whenever references are made which appear to state a fact, ideally we need to go back to the papers that they are referring to, or at least the abstracts, to find out how many riders. Then they state that there are purpose-made stools with a mobile seat construction that can be tilted in various directions, and these are commonly called balance chairs. And with these we can isolate the rider's movements from those of the horse to evaluate a person's intersegmental coordination of the head, trunk and pelvis, and movement symmetry during lateral left-right rocking movements. You can actually do a bit more with these, such as vertical rocking. That means taking, for example, hip and pelvis more to the front in rotation. So mimicking much of the movement that a rider performs when they're seated on the horse, except that in this situation the saddle and how the saddle positions the rider or seats the rider has been eliminated as a variable. I'm a big fan of balance chairs to evaluate the rider, and the rider can report back how much mobility they have in their hip joints and low back when asked to rock in the chair. Foot posture is known to influence pelvic alignment both in the sagittal and frontal planes, so from the side and from the front or back. So standing with one foot, showing excessive foot eversion, the pelvis will drop or roll towards the same foot. And we can see from this number of references that we can rely on that statement. The pelvic roll may affect spinal posture, and that certain degrees of scoliosis might be associated with low back pain. Again, we have a range of references here, so we can rely on that information. Riders competing at advanced levels have been shown to have a high risk, morphological asymmetries, and potentially chronic back pain rather than improving their symmetry during training. And that paper by Hobbs et al. Was really interesting because they evaluated over 100 riders at a dressage competition, so that there were several levels of competitors, and they found that of all the tests that they performed, the more years spent dressage riding, the more likely the rider was to be asymmetric through the pelvis and have muscular restrictions there in the low back. So that's a very good paper to refer to. And the rider's movements of the pelvis are thought to offer the optimal means of communication for higher performance. And pelvic movement, presumably mobility, is thought to offer optimal means of communication for higher performance. And there is another study which found that a key physical skill for the rider was hip joint mobility, and not necessarily degree of balance. This means by investigating the correlation between foot eversion during walking and asymmetry when rocking a balance chair, they can use that modality to evaluate postural asymmetry. So this is an intriguing piece of research. Their primary objective was to evaluate the rider's ability to perform a symmetric movement with regards to the frontal plane rotational and translational movements of the pelvis, trunk and head segments when rocking a balance chair from side to side. So this tells me they're going to ask the rider to rotate the pelvis to the same degree of mobility in one plane. And they're going to observe how the pelvis, trunk and head segments move when that's performed. So that's an excellent piece of research, because the relevance to the rider is that if they are asymmetrical in their hip mobility, then that will influence their upper body movement. Sounds obvious, but it's a great way to test it. The second objective was to investigate if there were any similarities between movement symmetry when walking and when rocking the balance chair. Based on previous symmetry in riders, it was hypothesized that the rider's movement pattern would be asymmetrical in general, they've stated that earlier, and that asymmetries detected in individual riders might display a relationship with left-right differences in foot eversion when walking. So they're going to see if there's a relationship between motional asymmetry and left-right differences in foot eversion. Again, very good study, because riders use stirrups to balance. And the design, 24 female moderately skilled riders, average age 22 years, but ranging between 21 and 25 years, I can assume this was a student cohort, with a mean body mass of 68 kg, ranging between 61 and 75 kg, so average weight, who were students in equine studies and were competing in show jumping at intermediate to advanced level and or dressage, intermediate A or B, and they excluded injured riders and those with any obvious foot abnormalities. They placed 8 mm diameter spherical markers on the rider's skin according to a full body marker model, and these remained in place throughout the trials. They were positioned bilaterally on the following anatomical points: acromial edge, spinous process of C7 and T10, anterior and posterior iliac spine, greater trochanter, lateral and medial malleoli, heads of the first, second and fifth metatarsi, and the distal aspect of the Achilles tendon insertion on the calcaneus. Clusters of markers were attached bilaterally to the participants' mid-shanks and mid-thighs. So here we can see all the markers. The last cervical, the shoulder, between the scapulae, the lower rib cage, the waist, the anterior, which is not visible in this image, iliac spines, on each hip joint, and at various points down the rider's leg. They collected the kinematic data in 3D using 8 motion capture cameras. They were positioned in a custom designed chair that provided a reference position for the kinematic recordings before they were introduced to the dynamic balance chair. So they took anthropometric readings of asymmetry before they tested them. In the reference position, each subject's acromial edges and iliac crests were aligned horizontally so that they were symmetrical in the frontal plane. In the sagittal plane, the head, trunk and pelvis were aligned vertically in a neutral spine position. For the walking trials, the baseline marker positions were recorded in a stance trial with each participant in a neutral standing position on a marked area on the floor. The feet were placed 10 centimetres apart, toes pointing forward. Shoulders and hips were aligned along the walking direction. So they've done all this for some degree of control of the variability between their subjects. Data collection. So they were seated on a balance chair which had a stable base with a seat on top and a metal rod that tilted around a pivot point located 0.3 to 0.7 metres below the seat, which was adjusted to the height of the rider. The seat could be tilted and rotated in all directions, forwards, backwards and sideways, around a rotation and tilt element positioned about midway between the seat and the floor, with a spring element giving progressive resistance towards the outer end point on each side and helping the rider to a small degree to return the seat to a neutral position. And this is the difficult bit, the rider's sense of positioning of what's neutral and how far they were asked to move the seat one way then the other. And they were instructed to rock the chair by placing more weight alternately on their left and right seat bones as they would do during different exercises on horseback. When doing this, the chair would rock sideways from right to left and left to right. And they were told to follow a frequency of 40 beats per minute, which was defined by a metronome. So they had to control this rising and dropping of the chair. So were they using their seat bones or were they using their hip joints? They were familiarised for 2 minutes before the measurement was performed, and 3 to 7 movement cycles per subject were used for the analysis. And this large variation was due to technical difficulties during data collection. So they're allowed to practice and then a number of repetitions, which due to the software malfunction, it seems to me, they could not quite collect the same data for each subject. In addition, 4 trials were recorded for each subject as the riders walked barefoot along a straight 10-metre walkway. Now, I would have just given them 1 trial, maybe 2, because they may have improved as they walked throughout a number of trials. And kinematic data were collected with the same measurement technique as for the balance chair, but with additional markers based on the feet. And this method has been reported previously. They analysed the data with software, but the data from 4 riders could not be used because of technical problems, as in markers fell off on one subject, or they were not correctly detected by cameras for 3 of the other subjects, therefore leaving complete data from 20 riders for further data analysis. So that's disappointing that there was a methodological failure for 20% of the riders in a small sample. But given that we would be extrapolating these results to the general population of riders, I'm sensing some weakness here. But nevertheless, we've got 7 researchers who are experts in their field, and we have a wide range of expertise here. So I'll reserve judgment on that for the results recording and discussion phases of this paper. So the rotations were roll, pitch and yaw, and positive clockwise. And these were expressed relative to the reference position, which was the chair, and the head, trunk and pelvis for each subject was aligned with the balance chair, and the movements of these were measured in the transverse axis. So they exported the data to another piece of software, and the symmetry of rotation and translation to the right and left sides was evaluated as differences between positive, which was larger degree of rotation or translation to the right, and negative, larger degree of rotation or translation to the left, areas under the curve. So we should be able to see that on some graphs later to clarify. And the foot model and its specific terminology during walking have been described previously. A positive value for foot roll difference indicated greater foot eversion on the right foot. A negative value indicated greater foot eversion on the left foot. So they're being very specific here about how their data was collected. Statistical analysis to identify intersegmental asymmetry strategies. A principal component analysis was performed. Asymmetry variables were normalised to have a 0 mean and unit variance, and only riders with complete data were included. So again, they lost 4 from the cohort. Principal component analysis rearranges a multi-dimensional variable space, in this case our body segment rotation and translation asymmetry, so that as much as possible of the variation is described in the first principal component. But I think this was potentially a novel task for a rider, because I'm not aware that they push down in the saddle in that way, and if they do, during what gait and for what reason. I think they're more reactive rather than proactive when riding, but we'll keep reading on because we should get an explanation in the discussion. But I'm nevertheless very impressed with the statistical analysis and confident that the results will be accurate. Regression analysis compared intersegmental coordination while rocking on the balance chair with foot eversion during walking. The dependent variable, the y-axis, designates the difference in degree of eversion between the left and right foot, and the independent variables on the x-axis were translations and rotational symmetry variables, as well as some of the pelvic and thoracic symmetry values, 6 models in total. And that was analysed with another statistical test, Shapiro-Wilks. Data was plotted to evaluate departure from linearity. Only riders with an eversion asymmetry were included, and the cutoff was set at 1.5 degrees because it was judged by the authors that asymmetries below this level would not be accurately detected. This established cutoff level excluded the data of one rider, I should say one more rider, for the analysis. So we've now lost 5. And the regression analysis is the bones of this study because their aim was to see if there was a relationship between movement of the pelvis and also the upper body segments, and with the foot eversion. The trunk and pelvic roll data were summed to include both riders that compensated for centre of mass displacement more with the pelvis or more with the trunk. So this is getting more complicated by the minute. To eliminate the variation of individual segmental strategies. And since the main aim was to evaluate if there was any correlation between torso roll asymmetry and the foot with the highest degree of eversion. And the results are shown in figure 4. And these charts show how they represented the raw data in chart form from just 2 individual riders. So the head, trunk and pelvis roll in degrees is represented, and the distance of the head, trunk and pelvis translation together with the timing. Although the overall patterns are similar because the movement of the balance chair was set, there is quite a lot of variation between these 2 riders overall. Not sure why they chose riders 1 and 4 though, but perhaps it's just to show what they did with the raw data, because as you recall, they had to organise the data because it was so variable and because of the volume of it. Symmetry values for each rider's translational and roll movements along or around the y-axis of the head, trunk and pelvic segments are shown in table 1. And some riders could be grouped together based on having the same pattern of deviation from baseline across the 5 variables. And they've marked that with the same grey shade. But in general, there was considerable variation between the riders. And the data revealed some tendencies to common strategies as well. In that, when 1 or 2 segments were rotated or translated more to one side, another body segment automatically compensated for the centre of mass displacement by rotating to the opposite side. So they've identified a pattern here. So when the body is vertical and a separate segment is in motion, if there is no compensation to mitigate gravitational forces, the body will fall over, the rider may fall off. And the trunk was the segment with the most pronounced tendency for roll, i.e. a higher range of motion. Now, the thought that comes into my head here is potential for back pain. And the pelvis showed only a small degree of roll, but more translation. I will want a more detailed explanation of that later. And the head had a more pronounced tendency for translation compared to the trunk. So I need a diagram to see the effects on the spine, because that's what I have an interest in with this paper. The head had a more pronounced tendency for translation compared to the trunk. Both translations relative to the pelvis. And table 2, we have 17 riders with complete data, displays the first 4 principal components, or eigenvectors, that accounted for 98% of the explained variance. The first 3 principal components alone explain the majority of different strategies between riders. How this interprets is that if you have 2 variables and you're looking for a relationship between both, in this instance, for example, they've explained that as one body segment moves one way, this will have a direct influence on moving another segment the other way. So this occurred for the great majority of riders, kinematics. And as I explained earlier, this is what the body reflexively does. One portion of it goes one way another portion will go the other to resist gravitational forces. For the first principal component, the major effects, having the largest weights, are the trunk and head translations, which are in the same direction and to compensate for the centre of mass translation, the pelvis rolls to the opposite side. For the second principal component, the pelvis, trunk and head roll have the major effect, with the head and pelvis rotating to the same side and the trunk to the opposite side. The third principal component also has roll rotation of the head, trunk and pelvis as the major effect, but in this principal component the pelvis and trunk rotate to the same side and the head towards the opposite side. So what they're doing with this results section is summarising their data. In the discussion they will explain it. So we're getting a very concise summary of the meaningful data collected, which they're going to explain in the discussion. And then they state again that they had a cut-off of 1.5 degrees so that they could observe it. And of the 6 regression models, only one produced a significant result, and that was for the sum for the trunk and pelvis roll asymmetry values, which was the independent variable displayed on the x-axis, while the dependent variables on the y-axis was the degree of eversion during walking, suggesting an association between eversion on one foot and a higher degree of rotation in either the pelvis or trunk, or a combination of the two to the opposite side of the more everted foot. And they've plotted the data and shown a regression line for the regression of pelvic and trunk roll asymmetry added versus left-right difference for foot eversion for 16 subjects, and this is shown in figure 5. So this is logical, and it is an important finding for riders because of the dependence they have on the stirrups for stability, notably of the knee and hip joints, and the asymmetry, which has been mentioned, because one of the common alignment requirements is the rider's foot, the heels down suggestion. And if one side of the body is in a different alignment to the other, with the result that there is asymmetry, then there will be asymmetry of loading. And they've mentioned in the introduction that symmetry is a requirement for skilled riding or competent precision riding. So evaluation of the rider's ankles before they get on the horse could be preferable than trying to coach the rider to align themselves in the saddle on the horse. And ankle joint deviation is a very common problem, not just in the population but in riders. So whilst heels down is a preferred position, this may be more challenging for the rider with ankle mobility. Now the juicy bit, the discussion, where the researchers will explain the results and the implications or the relevance for equitation. So this is quite a long discussion, and some discussions can be quite short. So I'm not really surprised because of the number of researchers involved in this. So presumably they've had contribution from most, if not all of them. So I'll just run through some key points. So they state that it's not within the scope of this paper to evaluate how well this balance chair is suited for evaluating rider-specific skills. So what they're saying is just because the rider can operate the chair, this may not transfer to postural skill while riding. But their goal was to use it in a test situation in order to evaluate specific postural skills for a sitting athlete. It was expected that riders would accomplish this weight shift primarily by displacing their pelvis, translation and/or rotation, because it's generally accepted that the rider should communicate with the horse mainly by the use of the pelvis, while avoiding large lateral deviations of the head and trunk. And to do this, the rider needs to create a lateral movement of one or more body segments from baseline, resulting in a lateral displacement of the rider's centre of mass. So basically, they just have to move side to side with the pelvis. I'm not sure if they were instructed to keep their upper body as vertical as possible, so that would have an effect on this. The effect will be dependent on the segment's relative mass. A larger mass in the upper segments, the head, trunk and arms, requires less translation and/or rotation to create the necessary leverage. But the rider could also create the desired effect by moving both upper and lower segments to one side simultaneously by initiating a small translation of the trunk before translating the pelvis to apply a force onto the chair and move it laterally. So what they're saying is that if the rider just leans the upper body slightly laterally, then that would facilitate part of the pelvic movement to move the chair. And this strategy will require a smaller lateral displacement to move the chair, likely making it easier to stop the chair before it reaches its end point. And yeah, we can come back to their opening statement about this, where they questioned whether the seat moving technique could predict rider skill, but it's clearly not the same as riding a horse, because it depends if the rider is proactive or reactive in some way. And we do know that expert riders tend to be proactive. So they anticipated that total movement of the pelvis, translation and roll would at least be as large as in the upper segments. But this was true only for a minority of riders. Which ones, I wonder? Almost all riders displayed either a high degree of trunk roll, which was in general 1.5 times the degree of pelvic rotation, and this is in table 1. I'll go back to that in a moment. Or trunk translation combined with a very low degree of translation. So they either had a high degree of trunk roll, which was 1.5 times the degree of pelvic rotation, so more upper body roll than pelvic rotation, or the trunk translation combined with a very low degree of translation and roll of the pelvis. The reason for this being that the chair presents an artificial situation that does not replicate the typical movements performed on horseback, which are driven by the horse and followed by the rider. Okay? But it depends on the individual rider. Another possibility is that the chair may make the rider feel the progressive resistance in one direction. The force applied in that direction is reduced and transferred towards the opposite side, which mimics how the weight is transferred on the horse during the mid-stance of each hind limb. So yes, there could be some transference of skill here. So if they rolled the trunk and head laterally, which is the simplest and most intuitive way of rocking the chair, i.e. starting with the head because it's the furthest away, it takes advantage of the long lever arms of these segments. But when riding a horse, it is assumed that the optimal way of communication should be through the pelvis. Well, that's not for all riders. It's certainly not for all novice riders who are perhaps more dependent on their hands for controlling the horse. And this implies that if the riders performed the lateral movements similar to changing seat bone when riding, the rider should initiate control and stop the movements from the pelvis while the upper segments are maintained more stationary, so the rider's centre of mass is not on the outer limit of the base of support. So what they're saying here is that at one phase where the rider shifts from one seat bone to the other, that's similar to operating the chair. But it took quite a lot of words to say that. So a higher degree of phase shift or vertical displacement between segments, the pelvis needs to compensate with the opposite rotation, translation. So if the riders are initiating the movement from side to side on the chair, using the trunk or the head and not the pelvis, this results in a large range of rotation or translation of these segments. And the pelvis will need to compensate with the opposite rotation translation, which will cause a higher degree of phase shift, vertical displacement, between those segments. And this may be the same between horse and rider. It's important to keep the phase shift at a low level in order to maintain the rhythm, which is one of the main goals during riding. So in other words, riding a horse is slightly different. And again, I keep coming back to proactive rider, reactive rider, proactively operating this chair as opposed to reactively operating it. Might have been interesting if they had a motorised chair so that a lot more of the rider's movement would be passive. And they have previously reported that during walking, the majority of riders had significantly greater contralateral pelvic drop when the foot with the higher degree of eversion was in early stance. So more movement in the pelvis when the opposite foot is everted. And the findings of this study showed that educated riders, I wonder in what way, did not have a symmetrical right-left pattern of frontal plane rotation and translation in any of their core body segments while rocking the balance chair. Something similar was found in the Hobbs et al. 2014 study, where they found that being a dressage rider over the longer term impacted on the symmetry of their pelvis and caused stiffness in the low back. So that could explain that finding. And when two or more segments were rotated or translated significantly more to one side, another body segment compensated for the centre of motion displacement by increased rotation and or translation to the opposite side. And this was compensated by roll asymmetry to the contralateral side in the remaining segment. And what this confirms is that the body will compensate to remain in balance. And they point out that we might assume that the more advanced level rider, as for other athletes, need to refine their skill training and define what type of movement strategy is optimal for superior sports performance. So this is interesting because I advocate that equitation skills training should be postural skills training. And in line with this, they have recognised that acquiring this skill should define what type of movement strategy is optimal for superior sports performance. And riders could potentially benefit from balance control training, since asymmetry is recognised as a negative trait in equestrian performance. That's a little ambiguous because it depends how the rider operates the chair and what skill they are going to acquire from it. But this nevertheless links with the lumbar stability paper, which I've covered. Some riders had a significant persistent lateral rotation of the head towards one side. and that was thought to link with the visual contribution to the regulation of postural balance, which tended to decrease with expertise, while somatosensory and vestibular information become more important. So they perhaps wouldn't tilt their heads if they had less reliance on the vision for balance. And if the head is out of vertical alignment, other segments might need to compensate. Yeah, good point. So having a lateral head tilt would initiate a compensation in another segment. And it is therefore somewhat intriguing that in a seated test condition, which is not too unlike sitting on a saddle, it is similar to sitting on a saddle, but the operation of the chair may not be similar to being seated in a saddle on a moving horse. But it showed that the rider's performances were asymmetric. One limitation, the use of skin-mounted markers. Well, yes, they tend to disrupt the precision of the reading because the skin moves when the body moves. And another limitation is the fact that the leg position on the balance chair is somewhat different to that of sitting on a horse. Yes, with stirrup support. So would that alter the balance strategy somewhat? And conclusions. None of the riders displayed a symmetrical pattern of the left-right rotations and translations in the functional plane. Which reminds me, what I like about this study is that it's about rider lumbopelvic, hip joint, knee and ankle function. And they did eliminate the saddle as a confounding variable. And a significant relationship was found between the within-subject difference of foot eversion during walking and the rotation of the pelvic and trunk segments during sitting, and that the side of the body that had a higher degree of foot eversion displayed greater trunk and pelvic roll to the opposite side when sitting and rocking the chair. So that is a very important finding for riders that use stirrups, because this study showed that this postural defect would initiate greater trunk and pelvic roll to the opposite side. So just going back to the table, there's a lot of detail there about individual level symmetry values for translations relative to the pelvis and roll degrees variables for 20 riders. So obviously in tables it can be difficult to see a pattern there because there are so many variables and riders. And table 2 shows the relative contribution, which was the weights, of 5 variables to the principal components under analysis. And the variance explained by the first 4 principal components is shown. To summarise, this was a highly detailed paper with 7 co-authors, all leaders in their field and well-established researchers. They successfully tested symmetry of controlled seated movement in riders with a piece of equipment that generated movement in the frontal plane that expert horse riders would execute while riding. The data was highly variable, and the researchers used a range of statistical tests and software to process the results. They found all subjects to be asymmetrical in their right-left pattern of frontal plane rotation and translation in any trunk segments. They also found a relationship between foot eversion and contralateral pelvic movement, which would be a useful rider evaluation technique off the horse, given that ankle joint misalignment is very common in the population. But something in this study that has been overlooked, in my opinion, is pelvic positional asymmetry. There is a tendency for riders to load more on the left seat bone and for the general population to show residual clockwise rotation in the left pelvis. So more loading and rotation on the subject's left side is likely to have influenced the symmetry of the left-right motion to varying degrees, and this may explain the wide variability of the related data. In essence, residual clockwise rotation to move the pelvis forwards on one side in the horizontal plane would have impacted on the degree of vertical motion, since there would have been a confounding variable of hip joint restriction in many of the subjects. Nevertheless, overall, this very high quality study points to the importance of rider evaluation off the horse for intervention and enhanced performance, particularly of those who are reliant on the stirrups for balance, such as those who rise to the trot and those jumping or galloping horses.